Today, 56% of the world's population live in cities. But by 2050, this figure would have increased to 7 out of 10 people. In South Africa, there are over 250 metropolitan, district and local municipalities. Over the past 3 decades, some municipalities have seen a mix of rapid urbanization, which comes with an influx of people and infrastructure development, while others have experienced challenges in service delivery and, by extension, meeting the needs of people. Focusing on sustainability in cities is therefore paramount for both the public and private sector to ensure that standards of living are raised and maintained for everyone. Now, to unpack this really interesting discussion, I am joined by Helen Charlton. Thank you so much for sitting down with us. You are an Associate Director in our Cities and Urbanization team. So let's get right into it then, right? So our PwC Cities team, which you help lead, must obviously see many effects of climate change on city infrastructure in particular. Can you tell me what are some of the most common critical effects of climate change that you're all seeing as experts in the city's space today?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me today. I think to start with, looking probably in the adaptation space, there's a huge amount of things that hit cities and obviously sort of the wider geographical environment, but obviously get concentrated in cities as well. And we're seeing such sort of impacts on sort of water issues. So obviously there's flooding, there's coastal erosion, there's also drought from water and the problems that come with that, issues with potable water as well. Then linked to things like infrastructure degradation, the problems with actually getting potable water to all of the citizens in many of the municipal spaces. From a heat perspective, there's real cooling issues, and in cities they retain a lot of heat. So obviously looking at ways in which you can mitigate some of the global warming and the heat that comes into cities. We have fire associated with that as well. And then more broadly, I think within cities, you've got issues around sort of infrastructure degradation, but also housing degradation. How do we sort of look at what, say, things like the heat and the flooding do within cities and to the infrastructure and over time? So road surfaces, are not the same as they were. I also think there's problems then with like transport congestion, and you talked about the numbers of people in cities, but how that also sort of the influx and sort of overcrowding many spaces can also cause problems. On the other side, looking at sort of mitigation issues and what cities are having to face from maybe more of a global agenda, they're now sort of faced with a lot more sort of net zero targets, looking at carbon emissions, how they move towards clean energy. And that comes with its own costs as well, because I think in many South African cities in particular, but also across Africa, they're trying to survive as they can with, reducing energy issues anyway, and then trying to look at how they diversify the energy source. So I think all of this impacts cities quite critically and the citizens. And there's a real sort of honing in of that in the sort of metropolitan space.
Absolutely, Helen. Now, how do you see cities playing a role in this nexus between climate change and development? So in essence, why are cities important in connecting the two?
So you referred earlier to the numbers of people coming into cities and how many people actually live there. To look at that from a slightly different perspective, global stats actually say that up to 80% of global GDP is actually sort of harnessed within cities. And within South Africa, we have 62% of formal jobs are actually focused on our 6 metropolitan areas. And if you include up to secondary cities, that's up to 80% of formal jobs. So there's a huge amount, obviously, of people coming into cities, a lot of investment, a lot of businesses, a lot of collaboration and job creation. And I think with that comes a lot of innovation, a lot of skills, a lot of discussions where, a lot of solutions to these problems can sort of come out. And I think what cities also do is they're a great space actually for being not only what they do in terms of their service delivery and the sort of adaptation and mitigation actions they can take, but they're a great sort of convening power for things like business and also communities and bringing those people together for kind of collaborative sort of discussions in this space. So I think that's one of the reasons why they're really, really actually important in this area.
I guess collaboration's always key, right?
Collaboration's key.
So obviously, with these very interesting stats that you've now put forward, basically majority of people, because of jobs, right, being centralized in these metropolitan areas, it brings this huge number of people together. So cities evidently play, a key role in how we can address kind of climate change issues. So let's talk a little further about how cities are focusing on climate adaptation and resilience actions then.
I think a key part of that in many of the cities actually comes down to sort of data collection as well. And there's a lot of focus, I would say, across all of the cities, but also metropolitan areas as well, on improving sort of data collection and the sources of that, and how they bring that data together in order to sort of better plan and mitigate against sort of climate and resilience sort of issues. So there is a huge focus with that at the moment. We are working with some cities as well on things like horizon scanning. So how do you better make use of sort of data, but also methodologies, and also tapping into global expertise to look at how you might actually, bring about better resilience planning in some areas, and looking at how we can learn sort of elsewhere. I also think that cities are doing a huge amount at the moment on sort of energy modelling and looking at what data they can bring in there, as well as diversifying their sources, also working with business, also working with the communities to bring some of that about. We also see a lot within cities as well of really, a lot of the major metropolitan areas have developed their own climate action plans. These are absolutely really huge and detailed in what they're looking at and how they adapt against whether it's coastal flooding, against drought, the impact as well on agricultural areas, which of course is a big thing in South Africa as well, what they might do around heat. So all of the major cities do have these and are trying to sort of work and implement with them. I think in other areas where we've seen key things from cities as well is what they might be doing around redesigning urban areas, looking at transport, looking more at green buildings. And on the other side of things, actually the collaboration point, how do you work with communities to design things as well? So we've had a lot of work that we've been doing with cities where they do look at actually really involving the community in some of the designs that they're doing. For example, some work we've done before with Soweto really looked, and this was over COVID as well, but bringing communities together to really look at actually service delivery in the area, but also economic development, and things that can actually sort of be improved in terms of climate adaptation. And I think there's a lot around that sort of city and also community collaboration, because those people are experiencing those things at the forefront. So you can't design things blindly and without those people involved.
Without their input.
Yeah, and I think that's been really critical as well.
Yeah, I love the point that you make about involving communities, right? Because we know that we're a developing country, and the South Market area, broadly looking at it, developing economies, right? So this is not only considering the needs of people, and I'm sure through these interactions you would learn about things that you may have not considered because you do not particularly live in that area, or haven't, it's not your lived experience, for example. But also it brings in their perspective. And am I correct in saying, would it also foster the transfer of skills and knowledge?
I think it does, and what it really fosters as well that I think we don't always think about enough is trust. So I think in those areas, yes, there's a bigger understanding from people in the communities on the ground of what it takes to change things and what barriers people working in the city might actually face. But also a collaboration around how things can be built. And I think in terms of that collaboration, then there's a lot of learning that will be transferred to communities on the ground, a lot of learning back to the city officials as well, and a lot more around trust building, not only just between, say, the city officials and community groups, but also perhaps sometimes between community groups themselves, which I think has been really important, and also with business where they've been involved as well.
Okay, yeah. Good ways of looking at making a difference in the societies in which we operate, right? Now, I'm sure it's a tough exercise considering the budget-constrained environment that we find ourselves in. As an expert in the cities space, speak to me a little bit about how you see cities coping right now, considering cash flow issues, for example? Yeah.
I think that's a big problem for many of them, and many do a lot of what they can with the resources that they have. I think first of all, just looking at their own sort of cash flow and what they're doing, cities really sort of, look at implementing good sort of revenue enhancement strategies. So they really look at, the baseline of what they need and where their revenue is coming from and how they can potentially sort of improve that in certain areas. Like, for example, energy, actually, and energy revenue is often a big source of that. So the more they can be providing, good services to citizens that are living there and bringing in the revenue from that, that obviously helps. Same on certain housing as well. So looking at their own revenue strategies is helpful. I think then for other things, there's looking outside of the city revenue and looking perhaps to the international donor community and what can be provided. I think there is a big focus in South Africa, but also Africa more broadly, on both cities, but also sustainability issues, and a huge focus from the donor community. I think personally what I've seen and what my team has seen with working with cities and the donors as well, is that the donor community can be quite flexible in the money they provide. Okay. Not that it doesn't need to be accounted for, but I think that they often take an approach that's more of a theory of change approach, and so look to work with the cities about incremental changes that can be made towards a particular vision, and not just saying you need to do deliverable X if we're giving you this money. So it's always been quite collaborative, in my opinion, and also then it allows cities often an influx of money that might be seen a little bit more as maybe a bit of a free hit, because it's not money that they could use to maybe experiment or look at from just some of the city revenue, but it might bring about new projects or enhance skills in a particular way, or enable things to happen where there's been brought in additional people that can look at a particular piece of work. So I think that has been very helpful. What I would say on the other side of that is that the metropolitan areas need to sort of actually probably market themselves and show what they're already doing, but also show themselves as having good governance and be credit worthy sometimes for some of these investments to happen. Yeah. And that's something that's always to be borne in mind.
Can you unpack some examples of particular actions that some cities have taken that show they are supporting inclusive resilience? So what I mean by this being that they are working in ways to ensure that everyone benefits, right? Not just people in affluent areas where probably infrastructure development and service delivery is kind of working slightly better already.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think a lot of the work that we have done does actually sort of touch on that, and obviously that means the work that the cities have done. I would say on many levels, so even the work that we have worked with cities on around sort of data and also digital inclusion as well, there's a lot of focus on getting that data right, and often getting that data right might be around actually looking at things like more in informal settlements than in informality. We've also done projects with the cities looking at things like financial and economic recovery post-COVID. And those sorts of things have really drilled down into, well, what's the informal sector and what's happening there and what's happening with sort of other people. So I would say from a data approach, there's definitely a lot more of a focus, and looking at other sources of data we can bring in to really understand what's happening and then better support people perhaps at the other end of the spectrum. Okay. And then I would say that there is a lot more that's been done around the sort of community engagement itself that I've sort of mentioned. Also things as well, like looking at how smart technology can be used, but not just accessible to people who do have money and the big cars and the different things anyway, but looking at actually how that can improve things within cities that then actually is important to all. And we've looked at sort of smart, sustainable cities in West Africa and some of the resources around there as well.
Right. Well, we're almost out of time. I just want to squeeze one more in. So in a country like ours, right, where issues of inequality aren't uncommon, how do you balance the continued problems of poverty and inequality with improved climate resilience in cities?
That's another really good question. I think on that, it's really a case actually of very much working together. I really think a big focus on how we can use sort of the international donor funding to support in that as well, and help actually try and dig deep into some of the problems and look at how we can use that to sort of maybe project sort of certain cities forward in what they're doing. Also, I think really focusing on that collaboration and bringing in business as well and communities to act together to sort of focus on these things. Particularly probably in the moment in the focus of energy being a big one, but also across other areas.
Brilliant. Helen, thank you so much. That was really valuable information. We really appreciate your insights, and thank you for joining us for another episode on PwC's Boardroom Forum Live.